The tower is a great feature in 2.2. It plays around with the gameplay mechanics, themes, and styles in a really cool way. But what if the person who reviewed it absolutely hated the feature? Well, that's what I'll be doing. I'll be using the worst game design ideas to look at all the decoration and gameplay and treat it as if the new player had no idea what they were doing. And yes, this was supposed to be an April Fool's video. So, without further ado, let's get into it. The first level, the tower, starts off with some aquamarine text, which symbolizes peacefulness and shows that the first level will not be that intense. It also then has two gaps, which you should clear easily, though it should have some indication, because it may be mistaken for grass, but you may not touch this anyway. But it might be good to tell new players they shouldn't do this. Then there are two crates which you have to jump on. But my issue is they fall without much indication, which is not a good idea because new players will get annoyed and leave the level, especially if it takes a second to get back. Some text would fix this, but I don't think that such important mechanics should be telegraphed this badly. Then there's some simple jumps with the same mechanic, but it has an orb, which I don't think should be introduced this early, especially with all the heavy amounts of decoration. There's a much needed checkpoint and some more crates which are even harder to get past and way too hard for level 1 already. Far too hard, and then there's some accurate fireballs with some very accurate hitboxes and some platforming, which brings us to the first blue coin. It is honestly amazing. The glow is such a good hint and requires a precise orb click that most players won't be able to do easily. Honestly, this has to be an A tier. There's this rope bridge, but my issue is it defies the laws of physics, which is not a good thing for a platformer level. New players probably won't understand how a bridge is moving like this, which is not a good design choice, because you want to stick your game design to the laws of physics. There's these saws after with no track, which makes it hard to understand, and then these rotating platforms. They rotate way too fast, so I turned down the speed to make it easier, especially since you're so far from a checkpoint. There's also this F- coin, because it's too hard for me, and this A tier coin right here. Finally, it ends with this cutscene, which is far too long, and is not good for people's attention span. I would honestly not watch the whole thing otherwise, especially with this peak content I watch. So, as I have looked through the first level, I've noticed something. There are a ton of flaws. Some critical mechanics aren't telegraphed well, and there is no consideration for how the player will find the experience. But it should get better, right? The sewer starts off with some simple jumps, with the poison and platforms already being introduced. The crates are fine, but then there's a fork in the road. You'd think that these crates fall like the one in the tower, but it doesn't. They just float. This is extremely bad because it shows that RobTop would rather make the level more confusing by trying to make the same thing do different things, which is a thing I hope creators do not endorse. This is in favor for what? The crate that floats up and down trigger? Not a good time to introduce a game mechanic, like what Geometrical Dominator did, and that is a very bad thing to be comparing to. Meanwhile, the blue coin is a D. It isn't visible on screen and it's a bit boring for what it is. And then there's a ladder which you may recognize from IRL. It works fine, but you don't climb on all the rungs, which is a bit misleading. There's some moving platform, but it's very punishing if you fail. A safe area would have been much nicer for this part, but it's simple enough for what it is. Also, what are these cogs turning for? There's these platforms that move back and forth, and these monsters showcase the GD Legal Imprisonment Punishment Corporate System Copyright Limited Deluxe. There's also a coin that builds off this, which I guess is a C. I mean, it's good storytelling, but you never get to see these monsters much again, which is a bit disheartening. I do not know why you cannot tell that these moving objects are possible, and I don't even know why RobTop made this indiscernible to a regular block. At least give it a different visual, like this. There's a checkpoint and there's some more moving platforms, but I think the level should have built on this more, because it's a bit boring because it's all the same thing. There's another gimmick which again shows that RobTop puts too many features and expects new players to learn it too quickly. These moving platforms don't even do much. besides being annoying. Why is so much introduced so early? And why is it so hard? There's now paths which are introduced in a safe space, but the possible blocks are not marked again, and it's just information overload. It's also really hard to get to the top. This door is even more misleading because the down button isn't even usable, but that is nothing compared to this. Yep, there's an insanely hard elevator in level 2. It has an intense song, dark background, and the robot from earlier. Nice. But new players will hate this part because it's such a difficulty spike. You have fire, platforms, spikes. This monster. Is this a circus? Seriously, this is too much for such an early stage in the level. It is almost unplayable. It takes ages, and it isn't even fun. I am losing it with this part. RobTop is making this so hard and complicated. I think an extreme demon would teach this better. But if you somehow survive that, at least you get this cool reward here. Time for the next one. It can only go up, but I kind of doubt that for some reason. The cellar starts off with some fog, which makes sense because of its old and dusty theming. You then see this robot and are convinced otherwise, which breaks the theming a lot. Especially since it tells you shouldn't be here, which encourages new players to stop playing this level. But if you continue, however, you go into the skull portal, which turns you into a robot, which makes no sense because you should become a skull, and new players will start calling this the skull instead of the robot. And come on, I wanted to match Rattledash's appearance. Anyway, you get to play as a robot safely at the bottom. And then you go on these moving platforms which don't move back and forth, showing RobTop again introducing a mechanic in too many ways. There's a simple corridor which this part should have began with, and the possible blocks are still not marked. There's the skull, and this shows that the blocks are flammable, but then it's kind of bad storytelling because the whole cellar should then go on fire. After this, there's more information overload with the snake, which has a cycle most players will get very bored of waiting, and it's almost auto and of course just a gimmick that doesn't appear anywhere else. It shows how RobTop adds far too many gimmicks, which should instead be used to more consistently prepare players for levels that actually use it to make hard gameplay. The robot shouts at you again, which makes sense because this is a train wreck, but most players will kind of ignore this at this point. You have the spike gimmick, which is hard to sight read and takes ages to get past, and makes it much worse for speedrunners because of its unsight readability. But then you have this part. It actually uses the old moving platforms, but is way too hard due to these spike platforms that make it very easy to choke because you have nowhere to go. This part is really inconsistent and confuses players a lot, especially since the other parts were much easier. And the possible blocks are still unmarked. Also, you can do this, which is even weirder. You end the tower with a boring cutscene, which you can move around in, which kind of breaks the immersion again. It also has the annoying robot, which tries to deter you when the level's forced on you in order to get to the boss. Sadly, you bomb Rattledash, which is too emotional, and new players won't want to continue, which is a bad design choice, due to how painful the previous parts are, and also how annoying RobTop made the previous parts of this level with such inconsistency. Anyway, this blue coin is an S tier back here. Amazing reward RobTop had to give to compensate for the painfulness of this level. After that, you have a good introduction with some simple jumps that have Jazzy Juice crystals. The issue is that these jump 3 times is too repetitive. Like, imagine Stereo Madness had 3 single spikes. There's also an A tier blue coin because this coin is confusing and is almost invisible, which is good because it's secret and, well, jumping is fun. You have some more possible blocks which look different now, and that's even worse. And then also you have these platforms that move on touch, which aren't attached to a chain, so they defy physics, but otherwise it's a good introduction. There's these icicles which force you to bait it, which shouldn't be added because new players will just go for it and fail, which makes them go all the way back. This gimmick is barely used, which is annoying. The icicles are also just something you wait for and not something interesting, because it's filler. After that, there's moving platforms which make you wait for another boring cycle, which shows RobTop again does not have consideration for people who want to play quickly, like speedrunners and casual players, and new players that are too brain-rotted to wait. There's more platforms and more waiting with gameplay that does not build off the idea very well. and is very short, which is really unfun and could have been built on. But no, it's just another gimmick. Even the blue coin is a D, as the spikes are gone, making it look ugly, and the coin is hidden inside a block and not a wall. The platforms here also has the same layout as the tutorial, so there's no difficulty change, but at least you have the more icicles, which is interesting. And I think the level would have been better if the beginning was not so hard, no one too many gimmicks, and the level didn't have boring mechanics and weird storytelling. This level is kind of a nothing sandwich, but there's one more, and it does a lot different. Here we are, the final level, at least before RobTop locks in on 2.3 or something. This part starts off on a purple cave that's a continuation from the previous level. It has some simple robot jumps, which are too easy as players were already introduced to the robot, but there's some large jumps which are at least fun to do. There's some spiked balls which are really unpredictable, and new players will not be able to get over them due to excessive speed and difficulty. There's more unmarked possible blocks, which I've kind of gone to. And then there's a blue coin, which is basically free, which is good, but it's locked between a boring cycle, which gives it a C. There's a checkpoint due to these spike balls, and there's this bridge which makes horrible music that the player will hate listening to while fireballs come, which are really unpredictable and shows RobTop does not consider side readability again. The bridge also breaks despite seeming sturdy, which is an extremely questionable design choice. Generally, you don't want to leave things like this to be misinterpreted and up to interpretation because it's very hard for players to understand what the gameplay is supposed to mean. So, another section with a ladder from the sewers, and that will take you to the next section, which will greet you to this factory background and this ladder, which is far too hard to cross. It's not only moving quickly, but also very trippy and difficult, forcing you to constantly look ahead, which is such a difficulty spike. There's a sign which shows that only Saws can enter, which gives the new players a false impression that there's a Saw game mode, but instead you are RobTop and you cannot pass. Better get coding. You are thrown in prison, and this unusually intelligent bat takes you to a factory area, which has even more designs and some more confusing different spikes and blocks decoration. If you get the hang of it, you may be stuck for hours anyway because you have to hit this button, which brings out a crate to stand on. This is super unnecessary. Just put the crate there, it adds no character to the level. There's some gameplay that is far too simple, and there's a conveyor which introduces the new mechanic on top of the confusing block design. It's far too easy as well and should include spikes. You have to do a lot of waiting for coin, and the spikes are harder to cross due to the conveyor direction. You can also get crushed, which is far too annoying and should not be included. The final corridor has a visually cluttering sign and a very difficult drop, and then the game overwhelms you by showing a machine instead of a ball portal, which new players will lose their minds with. You don't even know what you're going to change into, which is very bad communication from RobTop. There's a section where you collect all the keys, and dodging the monsters is far too difficult, especially for an introduction to the ball game mode, and should use some simple gameplay, with you even being able to get cornered, which is very counterintuitive. The monsters are also new and are too hard and make it very tedious. Same with this section, but it's even more annoying and even harder. There's a black spot and then the final boss, the Cursed Thorn. And oh my, it sucks. First of all, this pod has green fireballs which confuse players, and the attacks are random, which is a nightmare for all speedrunners. Second of all, there's minimal music sync, and the boss is so generic with very little attacks and such high health, it had to be nerfed in an update. It is also very boring to play, there's no attack balancing, and each section has little connection. It has no changes in scene, gameplay, or even with extra chase sequences or extra platform. It is poorly designed and even has a lack of sound, and with a big difficulty spike. And it's so boring, it doesn't even deserve to be here. Carstone, you disgust me. I never want to see you again. So bad. Sorry, where was I? Well, that goes to show how the tower is bad. Or does it? This video seemed analytical, but it shows that I assumed the player didn't know anything. But that's not the case. When new players try platformer mode, they may have already played these before from games like Celeste and VVVVV, and they will already understand the game mode. And additionally, it's okay to fail on levels because it helps you learn. And with all the charm in level with its story, the introduction of new mechanics to help players, and how the difficulty prepares you for harder levels, the tower is really good, and most people would agree. It's not hard and annoying, but rather fun and interesting, and it feels super entertaining with its ideas. So I really respect that. And this is what the tower would be like if it was reviewed terribly. Thanks for watching, and I'm gonna go pack to put some guardrails on my easy levels. Bye!